My husband texted me, "I'm leaving you. I've taken all our money, and I'm moving to Miami with my 20-year-old babe. Ha ha ha." His words weren't just a message. They were a gunshot to the life I thought I had. Most women would break, cry, beg. I didn't. I stared at the screen, my chest hollow, my hands steady. Then I typed 2 words, "Good luck." He thought he had destroyed me with a single text. What he never realized was that I had already prepared the battlefield long before he pressed send. I used to believe my life with Mark was perfect. He was everything a woman could want. Handsome, successful, charming in public. To everyone else, we were the golden couple, the kind that made others envious. Friends would whisper about how lucky I was, how Mark clearly adored me. I smiled, played my part, and convinced myself that happiness was real. But perfection has cracks, and sometimes those cracks appear long before anyone dares to admit them. It began with little things, moments that seemed insignificant at first. A sarcastic comment here, a dismissive laugh there. "You really don't understand business, Claire," he would say when I asked about our finances. If I questioned a charge on our joint account, he would smirk, pat my hand like I was a child, and say, "You worry too much. Leave the money to me." He turned every concern into an accusation that I was oversensitive, too emotional. Soon, I stopped asking questions because each one left me doubting myself more than doubting him. Gaslighting is a strange form of prison. You don't notice the walls until you're locked inside. When Mark said I misheard him, I believed him. When he claimed I exaggerated, I swallowed the shame. I told myself marriage was compromise, that love required patience. I wanted so desperately to preserve what we had, or at least what I thought we had. But deep down, a voice was whispering, "Something is wrong." I remember our wedding day. The moment I walked down the aisle, his eyes locked on me, filled with what I thought was love. I was 25, full of dreams, and he seemed to be the man who would protect me forever. I clung to that memory during the darker nights, when his voice was sharp as glass and his smile was only for others. Looking back, I wonder how I could have been so blind. If only I had known then. The wedding vows were just the first lie. For a long time, I kept pushing doubts away. But one evening, when Mark left his phone on the counter, curiosity overwhelmed my fear. I wasn't looking for trouble, I told myself. I just wanted reassurance. But reassurance was the last thing I found. A string of messages popped up, filled with flirtations and promises to a woman barely older than a college student. My hands shook as I scrolled, realizing he was investing more energy into her than into our marriage. My heart cracked, but strangely, a sliver of relief slipped in. Finally, I wasn't crazy. Finally, there was proof. That night, I started writing things down. Every offhand insult, every suspicious transaction, every strange late-night meeting. I filled a notebook hidden beneath the loose board in my closet floor. For months, I became a silent archivist of my own pain. It was terrifying, but each page gave me back a fragment of strength. Instead of internalizing his cruelty, I placed it on paper, making it tangible, undeniable. The financial records were the worst. I noticed transfers I hadn't approved, money disappearing in round numbers. I requested a copy of our joint statements under the guise of budgeting, and the numbers told a story far darker than I expected. Large sums had been funneled to accounts I'd never heard of. At first, I thought it was business-related until one charge caught my eye. The down payment on a luxury condo downtown, purchased in Mark's name alone. I sat at the kitchen table, statement in hand, as the reality washed over me. That condo had been bought with money I'd saved, funds from the inheritance my late mother had left me, funds I had entrusted to our marriage. Rage surged through me, so sharp it nearly blinded me. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had stolen from me, stolen from my family's legacy. And yet, as the fury simmered, another thought slipped through the cracks. He thinks I'm still blind. That was his greatest mistake. He believed I was too weak, too naive to notice. But he had underestimated me, because while he thought he was stealing from me, he didn't know I had already taken something from him, something far more dangerous than money. He had stolen from me, But what he didn't know, I had already stolen something from him. After the night I discovered the condo, something inside me shifted. Pain and rage were still there, but beneath them grew a cold clarity. I couldn't confront Mark yet, not when he controlled the money, the house, the narrative. If I wanted to win, I needed to be smarter than him, quieter than him. So I began to build my own secret war. The first step was evidence. Words fade, gaslighting twists memories, but evidence is undeniable. I bought a small recorder, the kind that could hide inside a flower vase or beneath the car seat. When Mark snapped at me, when he mocked me over dinner, I pressed the button. His voice, dripping with contempt, filled my devices. It wasn't much at first, but it was the beginning of a trail that couldn't be erased. I started backing up his text messages whenever he left his phone unattended. It was dangerous. Every second risked discovery. But the more I captured, the stronger I felt. Screenshots, bank transfers, even a drunken voicemail he left for his Miami babe. Each file went into a hidden folder on my laptop, encrypted and backed up on a cloud account he didn't know existed. Nights were the worst. I lay beside him, his body heavy with sleep, while my mind raced with terror. If he ever rolled over and saw the faint glow of my phone, if he ever sensed what I was doing, it would all be over. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced myself to continue. Every secret I stole from him was another brick in the fortress I was building. There were moments I nearly broke. Once, while downloading his emails, I heard his footsteps behind me. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the phone, but it was only him heading to the bathroom, yawning, careless. I smiled sweetly when he returned, heart pounding, and kissed him goodnight as if nothing had happened. If he ever found the hidden folder, I knew it would be my last night in that house. Collecting evidence wasn't enough. I needed allies. One morning, while Mark was away on business, I drove across town to meet Anna, a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She had survived a brutal divorce from a man not unlike Mark. The moment I told her a fraction of my story, she reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You're not crazy, Claire," she whispered, "and you're not alone." Through Anna, I found a lawyer, sharp, discreet, and unafraid of powerful families like Mark's. In our first meeting, I handed him a stack of preliminary evidence. He flipped through the pages, his brow arching higher with each line. Then he leaned back and said, almost casually, "Did you know your husband was once investigated for corporate fraud?" My stomach lurched. I had suspected Mark was reckless with money, but fraud? The lawyer explained that Mark had been shielded by his family's influence, the case buried before it reached court. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a weapon waiting to be unearthed. The lawyer helped me restructure my finances. I opened an account in my name only, rerouted a portion of my freelance income, and began transferring small amounts of savings I knew Mark wouldn't track. He guided me through reclaiming partial ownership of assets I had contributed to, quietly, legally, leaving no trace that could alert Mark too soon. Meanwhile, I met with a financial consultant who taught me how to identify laundering patterns, how to trace funds hidden in shell accounts. The skills were overwhelming at first, but with each lesson I felt the scales tipping back toward me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was planning. Still, the cost of secrecy was heavy. I returned home each evening to Mark's arrogance, his careless spending, his cruel remarks. I had to smile, laugh at his jokes, even feign affection while knowing the truth of his betrayal. Every hug felt like poison. Every kiss was a reminder of the double life I was forced to lead. But I endured, because endurance was my weapon now. Late one night, staring at the evidence I had gathered, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about our marriage anymore. I wasn't simply preparing for a divorce. I was holding a bomb. One that, if detonated, could not only end our relationship, but also dismantle the empire Mark had built on lies. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was sitting on a bomb that could destroy him entirely. Patience became my disguise. To the outside world, and to Mark, I was still the dutiful wife. I set the table each evening, plated his favorite meals, folded his shirts with care. When he walked through the door, I greeted him with a practiced smile, as if I weren't secretly gathering the kind of ammunition that could destroy him. But at night, when the house grew quiet, the facade cracked. I would lock myself in the bathroom, the water running to muffle my sobs. The reflection in the mirror no longer looked like the woman who had once walked down the aisle with hope shining in her eyes. I wasn't a warrior yet. I was a woman grieving the loss of the life she thought she had. The battle plan gave me strength, but it didn't erase the grief. One evening, I pulled my wedding dress from the back of the closet. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar, untouched since that day I swore vows to a man I thought I knew. I pressed the lace against my cheek and remembered the way he'd looked at me. Young, devoted, promising forever. My chest ached with the memory because now I understood. That man was gone. The smile, the vows, the tenderness had all been a performance, but the man I loved was dead. The one sleeping next to me now was my enemy. I realized that in order to defeat him, I had to understand him completely, so I began studying him the way a hunter studies prey. Each morning, I noted what time he left for the gym. I tracked how many drinks he ordered when he went out with colleagues. I watched the way he boasted about his wealth, about his ability to manipulate people, about how invincible he believed he was. Patterns emerged. Mark couldn't resist temptation. Women who stroked his ego, quick deals that promised fast cash. He chased them blindly, never thinking beyond the moment. He believed himself clever, but all I saw was a man ruled by greed and vanity. It was his weakness, and soon it would become my leverage. The more I observed, the more predictable he became. He texted the girl in Miami late at night, telling her he'd buy her the world. He bragged to friends about his untouchable financial schemes, laughing as though the law could never touch him. What he didn't know was that his own words, his arrogance, were sharpening the blade I would one day turn against him. But observation wasn't enough. I needed him to reveal more, to dig himself deeper. That's when I hired a private investigator. The man was discreet, skilled at creating situations that tested Mark's impulses. With subtle nudges, the investigator introduced opportunities, business deals that smelled too good to be true, invitations that dangled the promise of glamorous women and easy money. And like a moth to flame, Mark dove in head first. I remember the first report the investigator handed me. Photos of Mark at a nightclub, his arm around a woman who couldn't have been older than 21. Receipts for extravagant purchases he couldn't explain, charged to accounts I hadn't even discovered yet. Each page was another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. It was almost frightening how easily he walked into the traps, blinded by his own desires. I didn't even have to push. All I had to do was stand back and watch while he revealed the depths of his corruption. I felt a shiver of both fear and empowerment. For so long, I had been the one under his control. But now the roles were shifting. The secret was intoxicating. At dinner, while he ranted about a deal he was guaranteed to close, I nodded sweetly, knowing the details were already documented in the investigator's file. When he kissed me goodnight, smelling of whiskey and lies, I closed my eyes, hiding my revulsion, already imagining how his arrogance would look when stripped bare in court. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was chess. Every move he made, I countered silently, turning his own impulses against him. And he never suspected. He thought I was still the blind, compliant wife, clinging to a marriage that was crumbling. He didn't see the strings tightening around him. I wasn't just watching him anymore. I was pulling the strings. The text message came at dawn. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I opened it, Mark's words burned into me like acid. "I'm leaving you. I took all our money. I'm moving to Miami with my 20-year-old babe. Ha ha." For a moment, the room tilted. His cruelty wasn't a surprise, but the audacity left me breathless. He thought he had blindsided me, that a single message could shatter me completely. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. The months of doubt, the late nights recording his words, the files hidden away. They had all led to this moment. The fear that once paralyzed me ignited into something sharper, hotter. Fire. I typed 2 words back. Good luck. Simple, calm, deceptively harmless. He would take it as indifference. He would laugh, smug in his belief that I was too weak to fight. But what he didn't know was that this message wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He thought it was the end. I knew it was only Act 1. The next morning, I called my lawyer. My voice didn't shake as I explained everything, from the condo to the offshore transfers. I uploaded every recording, every bank statement, every photograph into his encrypted server. Within hours, he filed motions to freeze Mark's accounts. The same arrogance that led Mark to believe I wouldn't notice his theft had also led him to leave a trail wide enough to bury him. When the bank confirmed the hold, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't victory yet, but it was power. The first taste of power I had reclaimed in years. Mark thought he had emptied everything, but what he had taken was only what I had allowed him to see. That account had been my bait, carefully padded with funds I could afford to lose. He thought he had stripped me bare. In reality, I was watching him choke on a decoy. Meanwhile, the real assets, my mother's inheritance, the stocks I'd transferred quietly, the property titles I had re-registered, were locked safely under my control. The condo downtown? I'd already filed documentation to dispute his sole ownership, backed by proof of my contributions. The car he flaunted as his, leased in both our names, but now secured in mine. The empire he believed was his alone was nothing more than a house of cards I was already dismantling piece by piece. Mark, of course, was oblivious. He flew to Miami with his new prize, believing he had won. I pictured him stepping off the plane, sunglasses perched on his nose, his arms slung around a girl young enough to be mistaken for his daughter. He would order champagne, throw money around like confetti, tell her how brilliant he was, how he'd fooled me completely. And I almost laughed, imagining his face when reality finally hit. The investigator kept feeding me updates. Photos of Mark poolside, phone pressed to his ear, bragging about his clean break. Receipts for hotel suites and jewelry, all charged to accounts already flagged by the court. Every dollar he spent was another noose tightening around his neck. He believed he was free, but he was only digging deeper into the grave I had prepared. At night, I sat at the dining room table reviewing the growing mountain of evidence. There was satisfaction in the order of it all. The neat folders, the clear timelines, the undeniable proof. It was like piecing together a puzzle, except the image that formed wasn't a picture of us. It was a blueprint for his downfall. Still, there were moments when the weight of it crushed me. I would set the papers aside and lean back, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if this was who I had become. But then I remembered the girl in the wedding dress, the promises he broke, the inheritance he stole. This wasn't revenge for its own sake. This was justice. I imagined Mark raising a glass, the young woman at his side, laughing as he assured her he was untouchable. He would savor his champagne, revel in his illusion of triumph. What he didn't know was that by the time he ordered champagne on the beach, his empire was already crumbling. The illusion of Miami didn't last. Within weeks, Mark's world began to unravel. The bank froze his accounts, the credit cards stopped working, and his lawyer warned him of the motions I had filed. He came back furious, storming into the house as if he still had power here. His rage was a mask for panic, but he wielded it like a weapon. Almost immediately, he launched his counterattack. He spread rumors that I was unstable, that the stress of marriage had driven me into paranoia. Friends called me hesitantly, their voices laced with pity. "Claire, Mark says you're not well. Maybe you need help." Each word was a dagger. At family gatherings, whispers grew louder, and then the cruelest cut of all, his mother, a woman I had once considered my own, looked me in the eye and called me a gold digger who trapped her son for money. The accusation nearly broke me. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to tear down the facade and reveal every sordid detail of what Mark had done. But I swallowed the pain, held my silence, and let the sting settle deep in my bones. I cried that night, not out of weakness, but out of mourning. Mourning the family I thought I had, the life I had clung to. Yet even in my despair, I reminded myself, feelings could wound me, but evidence would save me. Mark strutted into the courtroom like a man certain of his victory. He demanded control of the assets, painted me as a manipulative wife who had driven him away. His lawyer spun a story of sacrifice, portraying Mark as the victim of a bitter woman seeking revenge. Watching him perform, I almost laughed. He had always been a good actor. This was just another stage. But what none of them knew, Mark had buried his own grave years ago. When it was my turn, I stood tall. My lawyer presented recordings of Mark's insults, texts to his mistress, bank transfers to hidden accounts. The room shifted as his words echoed through the speakers, undeniable and cruel. Gaslighting could twist conversations in private, but in court, his own voice was a noose. Then came the financial documents. Line after line of evidence revealed not just infidelity, but theft. And with one damning folder, the true weapon surfaced, proof that Mark had diverted company funds into his personal accounts. The fraud investigation that had once been buried was suddenly alive again, this time with irrefutable evidence in my hands. The final blow was one I hadn't expected. Mark's 20-year-old babe, the girl he had flaunted in Miami, appeared in court as a witness. Desperate to save herself from being implicated, she told everything: how he bragged about cheating the system, how he promised her luxuries with money that wasn't his, how he laughed about leaving me penniless. Her testimony shattered the last remnants of his defense. I watched Mark's face shift from arrogance to panic, from anger to despair. His empire was crumbling, not because of my vengeance, but because of his own greed. He had handed me every weapon I used against him. By the end of the trial, the judge's ruling was clear. Assets reverted to me: the condo, the accounts, the car. Mark was left with debts, legal troubles, and a reputation in ruins. The mistress he had abandoned me for slipped away quietly, no longer interested in a man stripped of wealth and power. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed like thunder in my chest. I should have felt triumph, but what I felt was something colder, quieter, a strange emptiness that victory couldn't fill. He had lost, yes, but my war wasn't about winning a courtroom battle. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my freedom. And that fight wasn't over yet. In court, his face turned pale as the gavel hit. But for me, it wasn't victory. Not yet. The gavel echoed one last time, final and absolute. Mark sat slumped at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear, but the panic in his eyes said everything. He had lost. The court's decision was brutal and thorough. Assets reverted to me, accounts seized, the condo downtown placed under my name, and most damning of all, the fraud charges reopened. His reputation, once gilded in wealth and arrogance, collapsed in the span of minutes. The man who thought himself untouchable now looked small, broken, and desperate. I stood there, my hands folded in front of me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim. I wasn't the woman begging for scraps of affection, or the wife silenced by fear of confrontation. I was something else entirely, a survivor. Every moment of pain, every night I'd cried into my pillow had led me here, not for revenge, but for release. When the courtroom cleared, I stayed behind for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. I whispered softly to myself, so low no one else could hear, "This isn't revenge. This is freedom." The words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried a truth I hadn't fully admitted. I had won, yes, but victory was only part of the story. Freedom meant stepping into a life no longer defined by Mark, and that terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me. But freedom comes with a price. Was I ready to pay it? The days that followed were both surreal and exhausting. Reporters called, wanting a statement. Friends who had once avoided me suddenly reappeared, eager to align themselves with my victory. Even family members who had believed Mark's lies sent messages of apology, shame dripping from every word. I accepted their gestures politely, but I no longer craved their validation. My strength hadn't come from them, it had come from myself. At night, I sat in the quiet of my home, sifting through documents, rebuilding my finances piece by piece. The lawyer helped me establish full ownership of my inheritance, ensuring no loopholes could ever rob me again. Slowly, the shadows that had hovered over me began to lift. The air in the house felt lighter, as if every cruel word Mark had ever spoken had been scrubbed away with the judge's ruling. But the true test wasn't in the courtroom. It was in how I chose to live after. For weeks, I wrestled with questions that lingered like ghosts. Who was I without the marriage? What did freedom mean beyond survival? Could I ever trust again? The answers didn't come quickly, but piece by piece, I began to rebuild, not just my finances, but my identity. I decided to invest part of my assets into something that was mine alone, a small startup, one I had dreamed of years ago but never dared to pursue under Mark's control. It wasn't just business, it was a declaration that my life belonged to me now. As the first contracts rolled in, I felt a pride deeper than any courtroom victory. For the first time, I wasn't defined by someone else's last name, someone else's shadow. With time, new relationships began to blossom. Not romantic, not at first, but connections built on respect and authenticity. I reconnected with old friends Mark had pushed away. I surrounded myself with people who celebrated my strength rather than diminished it. Slowly, the laughter returned to my life. Not forced, not masked, but real. And yes, eventually, romance did return. Not in the whirlwind way Mark had once swept me off my feet, but in something gentler, steadier. A man who listened when I spoke, who admired not my obedience, but my independence. It was unfamiliar, almost frightening, to be seen without judgment or control. But I welcomed it, knowing this time I entered love as an equal, not as prey. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across my living room, I poured myself a glass of wine and sank into the couch. The silence was peaceful, a far cry from the storm of the last year. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my lawyer. Attached was a letter from the prosecutor's office. The fraud investigation had escalated. Charges were imminent. Mark might face prison. I set the phone down, the glass cool in my hand, and for a moment, I closed my eyes. I wasn't overjoyed, not in the way some might expect. What I felt was a deep, quiet satisfaction. Not because he would suffer, but because justice had finally caught up to him. He had spent years believing he could manipulate the world with money and lies. Now, the world was closing in on him, and it had nothing to do with me anymore. I raised my glass, not to him, but to myself, to the woman who had survived, to the woman who had learned that silence was not weakness, but strategy, to the woman who had chosen freedom over fear. Never let anyone control your life again. That was the vow I made to myself, stronger and truer than any I had ever spoken at an altar. And as I took that first sip, I smiled, not because I had destroyed him, but because I had rebuilt myself.